Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Ignite Operating Room Growth While Energizing Your Staff. On behalf of Becker's Healthcare, I'm Assistant Editor Giles Bruce. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I'm going to walk through a few quick housekeeping instructions. If you have any questions throughout today's webinar, you can type those into the Q&A box you see on your screen. You will find a few engagement tools on your dashboard. Please check out our resources section and also make sure you fill out our session survey. We will have one poll question during today's webinar. When we get to the poll, the question will pop up in your slides box, and you can submit your answer directly on the screen. Thank you in advance for your participation. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. Lastly, if at any time you have trouble with the audio or video, please try refreshing your browser. You can also submit any technical questions in the Q&A box. We are here to help. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce our presenters. First, I'd like to welcome Whitney Johnson from Allina Health. Whitney has worked as a registered nurse and operational leader in surgical services for over 10 years and has experience in all clinical specialties. In addition to providing leadership support to a department with over 40 surgical and procedural spaces, her past experience includes programmatic and business development, as well as strategic consulting. I'd also like to introduce Derek Fine from Qventus. As a senior customer success manager at Qventus, Derek works closely with clients before, during, and after implementations to ensure that they have the best experience possible with the solution. Prior to Qventus, Derek spent 4 years at Surgical Directions, a boutique management consulting firm focused exclusively on perioperative services. In that capacity, he led complex perioperative transformations at hospitals and health systems across the country, working in concert with clinical experts to drive lasting transformations within surgical services. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Whitney to begin today's presentation.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here today. As mentioned, my name is Whitney Johnson, and I am the Director of Surgical Services at Abbott Northwestern Hospital, which is the quaternary hospital within the Allina Health system. As a backdrop to this conversation, I thought it might be helpful to give a sense of the size and scope of services at Abbott Northwestern in case it is helpful in thinking about how your site might also implement Qventus as a solution to support surgery scheduling. At Abbott, we have 36 ORs in the main operating room, as well as an additional 5 in the cardiac operating room. Annually, there are more than 25,000 surgeries completed. We support all surgical specialties and have a fairly robust robotics program. There are 6 Da Vinci robots and 12 robots in total in the main operating rooms, with plans to acquire a 7th Da Vinci in the upcoming months. There are more than 200 surgeons that operate at Abbott Northwestern, with approximately 30% of them being employed by Allina Health, and the remaining 70% being independent providers, which will be an important factor in why we chose to partner with Qventus. I'm sure that many of you are facing a number of the same challenges we have been facing, including all of those listed on the slide. Additionally, we are currently focused on right-sizing our staffing levels based on the migration of cases and surgeons to our community ambulatory surgery centers, and identifying where to hire as we backfill cases most appropriate for the hospital setting, taking into consideration skill mix of our staff members. While we deal with the day-to-day challenges, we also need to think strategically on how we differentiate ourselves in a competitive market. One of those ways was to implement Qventus to make it as easy as possible for surgeons to schedule at Abbott Northwestern. Given the success we've experienced to date, we are currently considering expansion of Qventus across the Allina Health metro hospitals in order to make it easier and provide a consistent experience for our schedulers and surgeons. We believe that doing so will also allow us to better optimize the resources we have today, including our limited staffing, by giving better sightlines to schedules across departments and improving overall efficiency. Part of why we're already considering expansion with Qventus is because of the results we've seen to date. And while there are a number of data points to consider, one of the most compelling on our end is that by partnering with Qventus, we are adding 3.6 additional cases per OR per month compared to our 2021 baseline. We are also seeing a number of other improvements, and we'll show you more of the positive impact Qventus is having later on in the webinar.
So before we move on, I know this slide tends to generate a lot of interest, so I just want to pause here for a moment before we go on. So the metric that Whitney just talked about controls for the number of rooms that are staffed per day. The reason that this matters, particularly for comparing 2021 to 2022, is that it just helps to filter out some of the noise associated with staffing fluctuations, COVID cancellations, or any of the other challenges that Whitney mentioned on that last slide. So at the end of the day, what this shows is that Qventus helps Abbott Northwestern make more efficient use of the rooms that they do have open, and then also to fit more cases into that time. So with that as background, I want to pause for a sec here and get a sense for how the challenges that Whitney spoke about earlier just resonate with the folks on this call. So with that in mind, as Giles mentioned earlier, let's take a pause for just a quick poll. I'm going to wait for 15 or 20 seconds, and then we can go ahead and flip to the next slide and take a look at the results. So go ahead and get your answers in now. All right, last call for answers. We'll wait a couple more seconds. All right, so let's go ahead and see what folks have to say. So you could pick all of these, and I think we're seeing a pretty clear winner, unsurprisingly. So gross surgical volumes and revenue. So we'll certainly talk a lot about the way that Qventus helps you do that as we go throughout this presentation. But improve OR access for surgeons, I think, looks like a clear second place here. And that's another theme that resonates a lot. I know, as Whitney mentioned that she'll talk about later, a large percentage of Abbott's overall sort of surgeon population is independent. And being able to reach out to those surgeons and increase access for them was a huge focus of this program that we'll talk about a bit. We also have a lot more coming about increasing utilization of surgical robots and some of that reduction in work and attraction of new surgeons as well. So glad to see that these are challenges that resonate with folks. All right. So with all that as background, so most of the rest of this webinar is really going to be about the story of collaboration between Allina and Qventus. And really a lot of it I want to be a dialogue between Whitney and I. But before we get there, I do want to take just a few minutes to give a little background on Qventus and sort of how we view our mission and place in the healthcare ecosystem. So to start understanding how Qventus fits into the healthcare space, I want to take a quick step back, just zoom out entirely from healthcare for a moment. So to do that, think about all the amazing tech in your personal life and what you've come to expect and rely on, particularly over the last 10 years. We've got some examples of that on the screen. So when you want to travel, you're able to book pretty much instantly and quickly look up all options within seconds online through Expedia or Google Flights or something like that. When you're browsing Netflix, machine learning suggests with kind of uncanny accuracy at times what movies you might be interested in watching, and it learns as your tastes evolve over time. AI also helps airlines manage yield optimization so that their flights stay on time and profitable, and crucially, so that fares stay lower for consumers. And finally, home automation automates a ton of our routines that were manual just a few years ago. Everything from turning on the lights, adjusting the temperature, locking our doors. In short, it basically just leaves us with more time to do the higher order things that we'd rather spend our day doing, rather than some of the simple manual tasks that used to require our attention. So we take tech like this for granted in our personal lives, or at least I know I do. But why shouldn't we expect stuff like this in our professional lives as well? And specifically, how cool would it be if we could do some of this stuff in the perioperative space as well? So that's really where Qventus comes in. So at our core, we're a health tech company that is just obsessed with simplifying how healthcare operates. So to accomplish that, we lean into what we're uniquely good at, and that's automating care operations. So for this conversation, we're going to be talking about surgery. But just as a background, we work across the hospital on inpatient, ED, and other spaces as well. We're constantly looking to grow our footprint. So in order to do that mission of simplifying healthcare, we've developed expertise in not just building AI systems and machine learning algorithms, but really in operationalizing that through automation and behavioral science to actually change end user behavior. And all this is done using our deep expertise across clinical operations, process improvement, and change management. So put a little differently, we know that all the cool tech in the world, a lot of which we're about to talk about in the next couple slides, is really only helpful when it's actually adopted by end users. So we put a lot of thought into how to work directly with the folks who use our product to make sure that they're feeling comfortable with it. So we take all that, we package it together into a single complete system for healthcare transformation that includes a real-time automation platform that we'll talk through, and then also best practice solutions and expert services for actually implementing that tech. And we've honed all that through hundreds of deployments of our various modules across a number of clients, including with the systems that you're seeing on the bottom of your screen. All right, so one more slide, and then we'll get into sort of the specifics of how the product operates and some of the results that Abbott's seen with it specifically. So how does everything that I was just talking about actually play out in peri-op? Right. So at our core, we really believe that every patient, surgeon, and OR should have access to the kind of technology I spent the last couple slides talking about. And that's why we've built the only end-to-end solution for perioperative growth. So the key to being able to bring this vision to life quickly is our automation platform. So the 4 boxes that you're seeing sort of going up in purple on your screen show you how we think through that full spectrum of growth, going way beyond anything that's available as a default in the electronic health record. So to start doing that, we take in data from the EHR, we use that to train our machine learning models, and provide the information for real-time insights. And crucially, we're also able to write information back into the EHR. And this bidirectionality, which we're really excited about, is really crucial and has a lot of implications for reducing burden on OR teams and just eliminating extra clicks and steps in the workflow and making the product a little bit more joyful to use. So with that foundation in place, we can begin attacking each of the barriers to growth that we just talked through. So sitting at the core of our solution, and we'll show you this in more detail as we go through today, is a really symbiotic relationship between components of the solution that create access and the components of the solution that sort of help you grow. So the products that we've built use behavioral science principles to create additional access in the OR, and then they automate growth into that new time by using AI to strategically fill the schedule. So the idea is that as volume increases, demand for more access increases, creating what we think of as sort of a virtuous cycle or the engine of the peri-op solution. So that removes the first couple barriers to growth. But we know that tech in a vacuum doesn't go far enough to solve these challenges. So what we need to really close that gap is real-time insights into hospital performance. So we come at this in a couple ways. So first, we have a really robust OR Insights module that sits on top of our core modules. So it supports sustainable process improvement and helps you highlight areas of further opportunity. And then finally, if you look at that top gain market share box, this is one that I'm really excited about. So that picture isn't complete without an understanding of what's going on outside the 4 walls of your health system. Right? So trying to compete in your market without knowing what your competitors are up to is both risky and challenging. So to help you do that, get around that and to remove that final barrier to growth, we believe it's necessary to inform decision-making and catalyze growth by integrating the most recent market data possible. So to do that, we've built on the backs of a really unique claims data set that encompasses more than 300 billion patient lives. And using that, our market insights module highlights practice growth opportunities for surgeons, identifies competitive opportunities for health system leaders, and much more. We'll talk a little bit more about this later, but it's really exciting stuff, and it's something that's only available right now on the Qventus platform. So all that being said, now that we know sort of what the approach is to holistically solving all these challenges and getting us to that future state, let's take a look at how this solution actually works in more detail, and we can zoom in on some of these components. So to do that, what I'm going to do is take you through each of the modules we just talked about. So I know seeing is always believing with this kind of stuff, though. So after I describe each one of these, what I'll do is I'll turn things over to Whitney to talk about the results that Align has seen specifically in each of these areas. So let's dive in initially by talking about optimizing access and doing that specifically through block release. So the first step that you really need to take to optimize access is to unlock as much time as possible on the schedule, as far out as possible. And crucially, you have to do that without frustrating your surgeons. So the good news is that it turns out machine learning is super good for that. And this is the first place that AI, automation, and behavioral science all really blend together in our solution. So we've seen existing software try to tackle this problem by taking a rules-based approach around when to send release reminders. But we found that a more nuanced, behavioral science-focused approach yields better results. So when we nudge, we want to make sure that we're being respectful of the time of the people we're nudging, since we know they get a lot of these already in their day-to-day lives. And this can include both surgeons and schedulers for nudges. So to do that, we only nudge on blocks once our model is really confident they're not going to be used. Our model is capable of doing this up to a month in advance of the day of surgery. And within that range, it fires the moment it crosses that threshold, and then determines that a block isn't likely to be used. But we know that releasing block is never the preferred decision for surgeons. So when we reach out, we let our end users see under the hood a little bit, showing them both the probability behind the prediction that we made, which helps sort of build confidence and trust in it, as well as how much their block utilization stands to benefit if they release the block prior to that manual release cutoff, which also sort of helps incentivize the behavior as well. And we also try to make this process as simple as possible. So the idea is if you look at that green button on the screen, if you get this email, all you got to do is click that, and then it immediately sends a notification to the OR scheduling team, letting them know that you'd like to release the block without you having to do anything else. So as you can see, this has a really big impact across our health system partners. One of the big benefits that it has is that it typically increases lead time by a lot relative to auto release. So blocks that used to sort of just sit out there unfilled will get released earlier. It also really increases the utilization of those times that do get released, so that you're actually being able to fill those with cases. And in balance, this also increases OR utilization as well. So those are the results that we've seen, I would say, sort of across our client base. But I want to turn things over to Whitney to talk about the results that we've seen at Abbott Northwestern specifically.
All right. As you can see, Qventus has allowed us to have some really impressive results related to block releases and subsequent utilization of the time created for others. In the last 3 months, we've had 269 hours of OR block time released early via the auto nudge process, of which 49% was then later utilized, resulting in 132 hours of additional OR time created and filled. Because we are very sensitive to how we interact with our surgeons, we were initially resistant to nudging as we did not want to overburden them. For that reason, we did have Qventus configure on the conservative side to start. I think this is actually a really good example of the partnership Qventus has demonstrated throughout the implementation process, specifically as it relates to meeting us where we were at. That said, now that surgeons and schedulers are acclimated to the process, we have been able to adjust the nudges to the standard across the other sites, resulting in Qventus helping us create more capacity, allowing surgeons to book more cases and spend more time in the operating room.
Yeah, thanks, Whitney. Really love seeing these results. And I guess one more thing to emphasize on the slide before we move to, I think, is just, again, emphasizing the flexibility that Whitney just mentioned, right? I think when we come in and we do these initial deployments with clients, I know we always have a perspective that we provide on how the solution should be configured, but we also, one, work with you at the start to pick the thing that you're most comfortable with, and then also can help adjust later on if, like Alina, you want to come back and revisit some of those configuration decisions. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit on robotics specifically. So as Whitney will talk about in a minute, increasing robotic utilization and access was a huge priority for Abbott. Qventus has a suite of tools that are designed to do specifically that. So one of the main ways that we do that is by identifying opportunities to optimize the usage of robotic rooms. So we know that these are really limited resources, and our goal is always to help you get the most usage out of them, which means making sure that those robotic cases are being done in those very expensive, labor-intensive robotic rooms. So based on the previous slides, it probably won't surprise you to learn that we do this through nudging. So the nudge that you're seeing on the right side of the screen is a great example of how this works. So our solution is sort of sitting in the background and will automatically detect when a non-robotic case has been scheduled into a robotic room. So basically not the optimal usage of that time. And then it'll start looking for opportunities to take that non-robotic case and move it into a non-robotic room, crucially in a way that's not going to inconvenience that surgeon. So in a way that still allows them to start at the same time and doesn't disrupt their day. So when we identify one of those opportunities, that message that you're seeing on the screen fires off to the OR scheduling team, which gives them the data that they need to optimize the usage of those robotic rooms. So that's one way we come at it, but that's not all that we do. So our available time outreach algorithm, which I'll talk about a little bit more on just a couple slides, automatically reaches out to surgeons who are the best fit for available robotic time, and our time finder system intelligently filters out non-robotic rooms when users search for robotic time. So all in all, what we see is that this makes a pretty big difference for our clients. So again, these are results that we see sort of generalized across our deployments. So as you would expect, increased robotic utilization, overall growth of robotic case volume, and crucially, that third bullet point, just help with getting some of those non-robotic cases that optimally shouldn't be in robotic rooms out of those robotic rooms. And then finally, it helps reduce the need to unnecessarily purchase additional robots. And what we mean by this is that it really helps you get the most out of the robots that you do have before you grow and expand to other ones. So as I mentioned, robotics is a really big priority for Abbott specifically. So I want to turn things back over to Whitney to talk about the results that she's seen in robotics.
Thanks, Derek. As you're implementing the Qventus platform, it is important to engage motivated surgeon champions. At Abbott Northwestern, our most motivated surgeons by far were those frustrated with robotic scheduling access. We were receiving very frequent complaints that surgeons were booking out much further than we would want them to, while also seeing many holes in our schedules, resulting in poor utilization. In working with Qventus and identifying those surgeon champions, we were able to bring transparency to surgeons looking for open time, and as a result, we were able to drive significant increases in overall robotic volume and utilization. Our first go-live in mid-May of last year was specifically focused on robotic surgeons. At that time, we had 3 Da Vinci robots. We brought on a 4th in mid-July and a 5th at the beginning of November. We just added a 6th a couple of weeks ago. We really could not have been able to justify the additional robots if Qventus hadn't helped us solve our scheduling and robot utilization challenges. As you can see on the slide, 80% of our robotic cases are now booked through Qventus, and we are seeing a 42% increase in the productivity per robot.
Yeah, thanks, Whitney. I think these are super powerful results. And I love, I think, to Whitney's point, that we see both sort of overall volume growth on this slide, but also crucially that increase in productivity per robot, which helps to justify some of those increases that she talked about. So the next thing that I want to get into is creating access, right? So we've talked previously about sort of the growth component of it, or sorry, about the access component of it. And now let's talk about sort of how we actually grow into that access that we've created. So typical scheduling software today sort of relies on the surgeon and the scheduler manually finding time by searching through what basically amounts to a glorified calendar. Or in probably an even worse case scenario, you might have the OR scheduler reaching out to potential surgeons they have relationships with who might have cases. So as I'm sure most of you know, there's a couple problems with this. So one, it's passive, right? So somebody needs to log in, run a search, find a time that works for them, see if it's available, all that stuff, which is doable, but can be time intensive. Two, it's really manual, right? So if you think about that calling outreach process, how many calls does the OR scheduler need to make to actually fill that time? There's no guarantee that the first or the second or even the third call is going to resolve that. And finally, it's not strategic, right? So maybe you do manage to fill that time, but it doesn't get allocated to a service line that's a real fit for your hospital or health system's strategic priorities. So what Qventus does is it helps automate this process. So we have an algorithm that is tailored to your strategic goals that takes into account case contribution, strategic service lines you're taking to grow, all of that stuff, and a whole bunch of other variables that we can work with you to fine tune. And then what it does is it takes all that information and uses that to find the best fit surgeon for each individual block of time based on their booking patterns, previous engagement, et cetera. And then it reaches out to them with tailored notifications about times in the schedule they could slot in that would be a good fit for them. So what we're doing is we're actively reaching out to surgeons in an automated, prioritized manner that's in line with your strategic goals. And that removes the burden from the OR scheduler and the surgeons of actually having to manually reach out and fill that time. And we're continuing to expand sort of our work around this feature. We've recently sort of made some upgrades that we'll talk about later that allow schedulers to sort of personalize the type of outreach that they receive. So with all that being said, I want to show you what that looks like at Abbott specifically. So what you're seeing on the screen here is how many net new cases we've been able to add at Abbott just through our machine learning powered outreach. So there's sort of growth in other ways that we'll talk about later. But for here, what you're looking at is the combination of folks booking into time that was released through our nudges, and then also booking into time using those ATO available time outreach nudges that I just talked about. So that being said, I'll turn it back over to Whitney for a little more context on what Align has been seeing.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there are more than 200 surgeons that operate at Abbott Northwestern. Given the large open access nature of our hospital, the Qventus capability around automated strategic outreach is incredibly valuable, as that type of outreach could never be managed by our scheduling team alone, nor would we want them to be spending their time that way. As you can see, we've seen a significant number of cases added by automated strategic outreach, with an average of 30 additional cases per month in the last 2 months alone, which is tremendous and has been really helpful as we work toward meeting our volume targets. Not only are these results positive from a financial perspective, automated outreach has the potential to create goodwill with the surgeons that schedule within the hospital by prioritizing their cases when there is available time, and to Derek's earlier point, really allowing us to prioritize those clinical service lines that are highest priority for our hospital.
Awesome, thanks, Whitney. So we've talked about how you create space and also how you can fill that space through automated outreach. But to augment that, you do still need to have a self-service way for surgeons and schedulers to actually access your schedule. And that's where TimeFinder comes in. So TimeFinder does this in a way that removes friction to get on the schedule and book into white spaces. And it creates a true digital marketplace for time, sort of flashing back to like that Expedia or Google Flights-like interface that you sort of saw on the screen earlier. So before we dive in, let's sort of think about the way things used to be for this. So traditionally, if I needed to find open time, I just call the OR scheduling team, right? They would be getting a ton of these calls from many different offices. Often I might be put on hold. And then when I did get through to one of the OR scheduling team members, I'd have to sit on the phone and wait for time sort of going through slot by slot. So after that, you sort of had scheduling 1.0, right? So essentially digitizing a calendar, but still requiring you to click through and search and find a good time day by day. So at Qventus, what we're really focused on is next-gen scheduling. So just like Google, we learn your patterns so that we can personalize the output that you're seeing when you search to you. So this takes into consideration a whole bunch of things like when you have clinic, when you like to practice, how long your cases typically take, all that kind of stuff. So we show you all the options across your search range in a single glance, down to the hours that are available in a prioritized order. So it basically creates a clear, easily viewable marketplace for time that filters out all the noise that's not available and just zeroes in on what you could actually use. So add all that up, allows you to find time in 10 seconds, just a couple clicks, book within a few minutes, and then to get that time confirmed before the patient makes it home from the office. So crucially, this process also helps reduce manual transcription errors in addition to the benefits that you're seeing on the left. And through that, it helps to increase patient safety as well. So for more on that and also the other benefits that Align has seen from TimeFinder, I'm going to turn things back over to Whitney again.
Thank you. In working with Qventus on a go-live approach, we decided to deploy access to the department in 3 waves, which is reflected on the graph. Each go-live was appropriately spaced apart from one another to allow for learnings and adjustments as we went. As you can see, we've had really positive results since implementing Qventus, but what I want to draw your attention to is the sustained engagement in using Qventus for scheduling post-go-live. With some new technologies, you see an initially high level of engagement and a drop-off after the newness wears off. But with Qventus, we have experienced a sustained high level of utilization over time, with 2 out of every 3 elective cases being scheduled through Qventus. Part of what we attribute the sustained engagement to is the ease of using Qventus on the surgeon scheduling end. In talking with the schedulers across clinics, they want to use the method that is easiest for them. So while we have not eliminated their ability to schedule using other processes, they have shifted the bulk of their scheduling requests to Qventus. And I did catch a question in the chat that's directly related to this. There was a question about if we're scheduling 80% through Qventus, what's happening with that other 20%? And that's what I'm talking about right here is we have 4 different methods currently available for scheduling, whether they call, email, do a case request, or use Qventus. And what we're seeing is even though we haven't limited their ability to use those other methods, the engagement with Qventus, as you can see on this graph and in that prior slide, has remained really high. In addition to Qventus providing an incredibly efficient platform for surgery scheduling, at Alina, to Derek's point, we also believe that the platform allows for safer scheduling with fewer opportunities for the transcription errors he mentioned and other types of errors that could lead to patient harm. And we'll talk a little bit about how we're doing that and how we're supplementing that, I would say, with some new technology that just came out this year. When we first shared our plans to implement Qventus, a number of people were concerned about the potential impact to our scheduling team. This was at a time when organizations across the healthcare industry were facing unprecedented financial challenges. So the question naturally followed around whether or not Qventus would lead to layoffs of surgery schedulers. That was and is not our intent. Rather, the implementation of Qventus has resulted in significantly improved morale among our scheduling team. They are all trained to handle cases submitted through Qventus. It has led to less manual work, and they're reporting greater job satisfaction at a time when retention is really key.
Thanks, Whitney. So I think that's sort of most of the components of our solution, but I want to end on this last one too. So in our intro, we talked about how Qventus isn't just a partner for automating growth. We're also a partner for getting leaders the streamlined data that they need to really make those key decisions. So we come at this in a couple different ways. So the first is a really market-focused growth angle, and this is that really cool data set that I mentioned earlier. So using that unique claims data set, we're able to give you unprecedented insight into the dynamics of your market. So our dashboards help you compare your health system share and volume trends relative to other providers in the region. We can also help you drill down into areas where your system is growing faster than competitors and case types and service lines where your growth rates are lower than other facilities. You can then drill down into referral patterns by geography, identify regions from which you get fewer referrals, and all of this is available at the surgeon level as well, which ends up being really powerful. So the second of these that I mentioned earlier is focused on peri-op KPIs. So what you can see on the right here and then down below as well. So leaders in different parts of the organization, we know understandably have different focuses, right? So you might have like one dashboard at the exec level, one dashboard at the OR leader level, surgeon level, and in each of those dashboards, we're tailoring the information to specifically what that user persona would want to see. So these dashboards are meant to be both retrospective and forward-looking, giving you a sense of both where you are and how we predict things will play out in the future. Finally, and this has been really crucial for a lot of the work that we've done with Abbott, we also track and display detailed engagement data around how end users actually interact with our product. And we show this to you as well. So in conjunction with our hospital partners, this lets us tailor interventions and outreach around the users who could use the most reinforcement, helping to ensure maximum adoption of the platform. So basically, if we see that there's a key office or a surgeon who maybe hasn't been engaging with the platform as much as we hoped or hasn't joined as quickly as we wanted after the launch, we can spot that in real time, and then we can use some white glove intervention to actually bring them into the fold and help do some additional education. So all that said, I know Abbott is a really sort of sophisticated data organization as well, so I'd love to turn things back over to Whitney to talk about how Allina specifically thinks through data.
Yeah, thank you. So, Allina is very fortunate to be data rich, and it's an organizational priority to use data to help make decisions. That said, while we have a number of tools at our disposal, Qventus is one of the only applications that we can use to look forward and make predictions, which we find to be particularly helpful as we manage our business and consider new tactics and support our surgical strategies. And I would just reiterate the reporting that we get out of Qventus that does allow us to do those just-in-time interventions that Derek referenced has been hugely helpful. So when I see the report of who's using it and who's not using it, and then I pass that surgeon in the hallway, there's a really natural opportunity to ask what's going on, if they have any feedback, and from there we're making adjustments as needed to make sure the program is optimized for the needs of our surgeons and schedulers. So it's an important call out, and the visibility to the data is really, really good.
Yeah, I love that. That connection to sort of the data and the individual is really cool. So I think now that we've gotten a chance to hear about how the Qventus platform works and some of the results that it's been able to achieve at Abbott Northwestern, I want to take the rest of our time to do this a little more informally and to take a really deep dive into how Qventus and Allina actually partnered together to make this happen. So to accomplish that, Whitney and I are going to take a look back on a couple of key points throughout the implementation, and then we're going to be sure to reserve time at the end to take any questions that have been coming into the chat as well. And apologies if my video is frozen. I'll try to get that refreshed in a second. So to start us off, so we've gotten a chance to hear about the Qventus platform and some of the results it's been able to achieve at Abbott. But one of the things that I want to zero in on specifically here is sort of the way we've been able to work together to actually influence product development, right? So one of the things that I love doing is the Qventus team got a chance to come on site back in November. During that visit, we got a chance to meet with clinic schedulers from a whole bunch of clinics, both employed and independent, and get a bunch of really robust feedback about how people were actually experiencing the product day to day. So I'll talk about this later, but one of the things that I love about working here is that we're able to quickly incorporate feedback that we get like that into our product. So after those meetings, we'd have a chance to go back and talk to our development teams and let them know what we were really hearing from users and sort of raise those concerns up. And we were actually able to roll out some of this functionality just within a couple months, including this month as well. So all that being said, Whitney, I'll turn things back over to you and just say, can you talk a little bit about some of the features that are coming out early this year that your team is super excited about?
Yeah, thank you. There are a handful that are coming to mind. I think probably the enhancement we're most excited about are the surgeon preferences, which you kind of alluded to. It's an in-app calendar that allows schedulers to document unavailable time for their surgeons, whether they be in clinic, on PTO, or unavailable for some other reasons. It will feed into Time Finder and ATO, making searches and recommendations more personalized. And again, going back to a comment made earlier, by doing this and having it be more personalized, we run a lesser risk of burdening a surgeon with over communication or nudges when they're just not going to be available. So the surgeon preferences, I think, are going to be really huge. I also am very excited about the multiple document uploads that I mentioned earlier. This allows the scheduler the ability to attach multiple documents to each case request in Time Finder. As mentioned, we think this functionality promotes safer scheduling practices by allowing additional source documentation, including the informed consent to be added to the case request at the time of scheduling. The last couple I would mention would be the automatic filtering, which helps prevent a case from being scheduled in a room that can't actually accommodate it. The custom procedure order forms and the Time Finder personalization. And all three of those things, I think, are going to continue to allow us to help better meet surgeons and schedulers' expectations with regard to access, and then making those processes as efficient as possible by customizing the fields that appear when they interact with the platform. And again, just the Time Finder personalization, which will directly connect the scheduler to the surgeons that they specifically schedule for, so they're not doing any unnecessary searches within the program.
Yeah, thanks so much, Whitney. I think, yeah, it's been super cool to actually sort of close the loop here too. We got a chance to go back and present some of the stuff to the Alina OR scheduling teams over the last couple weeks, and it was really fun to be able to say, hey, we took your feedback, we listened to you, and here's how we're actually using it to inform the product. So now that we've sort of talked about where we're going or where we currently are, I'd like to flash back to a moment to where we started. So specifically to the process of actually getting ready for that initial go live back in June. So as I'm sure all of you have experienced, software go lives involve a ton of moving pieces, and coordination between the vendor and the client can be really challenging. So Whitney, how did your team and the Qventus team work together to make sure that the actual implementation of this product was successful?
Well, I think the most important thing we did to prepare was put the right team in place to support implementation and go live. As an organization, we have pretty deep experience in implementing new technologies, as well as established processes for doing so, including the assignment of an IS project manager to help support the work. That individual, in partnership with our surgical services business manager and the Qventus team, supported the bulk of the technical work and effort in getting the platform integrated with our EMR, which I'm seeing other questions in the chat. We use Epic, for those who are wondering about that. And truly, feedback from the IS project manager assigned to the Qventus implementation was incredibly positive. She actually stated something to the effect of, this was the most smoothest technology implementation I've ever been a part of. And she attributed much of that success to the support that the team received from Qventus. So the implementation was quite smooth. I did see another question about the IS lift from a project hours standpoint, which maybe, Derek, if you have some insight to that, I can't say that I specifically recall. But the other really important thing we did to ensure a smooth implementation was take a proactive approach with regard to communication. Qventus provided us with communication templates that were super helpful and provided really good information we needed to get to our surgeons and schedulers early in the process. And one thing we did to really make that a smoother process was we funneled all of those communications, while provided by Qventus, through our business manager, Donna, who had the existing relationships with the surgeon schedulers, which allowed us to further establish trust and work through the change management process with a bit more ease.
Yeah, I can close, I guess, on the IT a little bit. So I think, to Whitney's point, one of the things that we try to do is to be as prescriptive as possible. So I think when we start engaging with clients initially, there's a sort of a table that we have that tells you sort of exactly per role how many hours are going to be required. The biggest lift on the IT side, and I hope I'm not speaking out of turn for my IT colleagues, but is generally just the report writing, right? So it's the work needed to sort of get the extracts that we need to power the solution out of Epic or out of Cerner, and then into our solution. And that is pretty front-loaded towards like the first month or two of the implementation. And then once that report writing work is in place and everything is coming over smoothly and we're consistently receiving those files, the IT bandwidth required to engage drops pretty significantly after that. And then once we actually sort of launch the product and go live, there's I would say little to no IT requirement. Okay, so during that last question, we talked about the implementation at a high level, but I want to zero in a little bit on what this experience was like for surgeons. So we've talked a couple of times about sort of how big of a part of this process they are. And we know that they're also one of the primary beneficiaries of this solution as well. But getting surgeon buy-in, I think, as we've all experienced, can definitely be a little challenging. So I guess, Whitney, how did you work to engage surgeons as part of this process and make sure that they felt comfortable with what was going to happen?
We're really fortunate to have a very engaged surgeon advisory group, which consists of both formal and informal surgeon leaders across specialties. We brought them into the decision-making to implement Qventus early, and we leaned on them for change management support. Their early engagement helped with strong and quick adoption among their peers. Additionally, we were really focused on selecting the right surgeon champions based on their individual motivations to engage with Qventus, whether it be a surgeon who needs access but doesn't yet have a block, or the use case we discussed in pretty extensively here today around robotic access. Because robotic access was such a driver for many surgeons, they were in our phase 1 go live and continue to be some of our highest utilizers of the scheduling platform. The other thing I'd highlight is what Derek alluded to a little bit earlier. Qventus came on site multiple times and worked directly with both the hospital surgery schedulers and the clinic schedulers, which gave everyone an opportunity to understand how the product was being used and problem solve in the moment if there were questions or adjustments that needed to be addressed.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so we've got a few more of these, and then we'll get to just opening for the audience questions. So in our results section earlier, I know we talked a lot about some of the leading indicators of success from the Qventus implementation. So cases added through AI, streamlined scheduling process, open time created, all that kind of stuff. But I know that's not all Allina was focused on. So we talked about this a little bit already, but can you talk a little bit about sort of the safer surgery initiative that Allina has, why that's been such a priority for the organization, and then sort of how Qventus and TimeFinder have folded into that story?
Sure. I would say that before Qventus, our team was spending too much time with manual scheduling processes. That said, we have been working as an organization toward electronic scheduling for some time with varying success, especially when factoring in whether the surgeon is employed by Allina Health and therefore using our EMR in the clinic or an independent provider using another health record. So Qventus has allowed us to overcome some of the challenges we've had around electronic scheduling by automating the process and providing access to all schedulers and surgeons, regardless of whether or not they're employed or independent. As mentioned previously, we also believe that the multiple document upload functionality contributes to safer scheduling by having those additional source documents available to confirm the patient is being scheduled for the correct procedure.
Awesome, thanks. So this is another one that I think we've already covered a little bit as well, but I want to sort of really put a nail in it. So we talked about robotics earlier. I know, again, as we mentioned, that's been a real focus for Allina as you've continued to really just grow by leaps and bounds over the last year or so. So throughout that growth, how has Qventus sort of helped your team optimize the access to those surgical robots?
I think the biggest thing is that Qventus is providing visibility to the open time or white space in our schedules. And this is particularly helpful when a case gets canceled because it provides more of an opportunity to backfill, which has been tremendously helpful as we've worked through the past many months of COVID. And the automatic filtering I mentioned, that just went live recently, that functionality is also really helpful since it allows our users to search for a robotic room more efficiently. In gathering feedback from our scheduling team, they're telling us that they want to follow the path of least resistance to get their cases on. And I would say Qventus generally and the automatic filtering more specifically are helping to support that for robotic cases in particular.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So this is one I like a lot. So one of the things that I think we always aim to do, and to your point earlier, is to make life easier for our partners and to really help them realize their goals. So could you talk a little bit about how Qventus empowers you and your team to sort of manage better and to meet your goals at Abbott?
Yeah, I think about this kind of a couple of different elevations. So when I think about managing my staff, the person who comes to mind first as it relates to Qventus is my business manager, who prior to Qventus was doing a ton of manual reporting, data pulls, running utilization reports that were super time consuming and probably not the best use of her skill set or really where she wanted to be placing her energy. And so this is one tool that we've been able to put in place to really allow her to be more efficient in doing her work and then kind of doing those higher order activities that we really need her to be focused on. So when I think about it, kind of that granular levels, that role and that type of work is what really comes to mind given all of the automation in reporting. But then at a higher level, I mean, we want to be taking care of as many patients as possible, and we want to make it as easy as possible to do business at Abbott Northwestern and within Allina Health. And so when we just think about our general caring mission, Qventus is allowing us to help take care of more patients, which is consistent with that mission. So it depends on the elevation how I would answer that, but I haven't seen an elevation where it isn't adding value at this point.
Yeah, I love that. And I'll sort of take a moment here to plus one Whitney's comments around just like how amazing the Abbott team has been to work with. There's just a rockstar group of business managers and OR schedulers, leaders, and IT folks there. And it's just been really fun to get to collaborate and work with them on this process. So we've got one more, and then we'll flip into the Q&A. So I want to end by being as forward-looking as we can here. So I think I mentioned this earlier, but one of the things that I love the most about working at this company is that we really get to actively innovate and to push the boundaries to what's possible in the peri-op space, right? It's not a static product; it's constantly evolving, and it's doing that using the feedback that we get from customers. And getting to do that within an organization is cool and it's fun to work with as Allina. As I mentioned, it's just been a lot of fun. So, so Whitney, as you look ahead to the future of the Qventus Allina partnership, what are you most excited about? What are you looking forward to?
Well, I reflect back on our last visit in November where we, came together a group and really talked about our goals as we move forward. And I think the main thing is that I have a strong sense that we've only really scratched the surface of the roadmap in this partnership between Qventus and Abbott and more broadly Allina Health. And so that is really exciting to me to know that we're working with a partner who's asking us for feedback, asking us what we want help with and where our strategies can be supported by their analytics and by their programming. So I think that that's all really, really exciting. I think, as I mentioned previously, I'm thankful that this program is allowing employees to be freed up to do other work that's more energizing. I'm very excited about the fact that it's helping to support engagement and sustainability within our workforce, and that's all very good as well. And then, I think a future opportunity that we're really starting to look at is how do we use the automation to improve patient flow and benefit from those downstream effects of having improved flow, whether it be patients flowing out of our PACU to inpatient beds or flowing out of phase 2 for an outpatient surgery. So I think the opportunity to explore automation in support of patient flow is going to be huge.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, plus one to all of that, and definitely super excited about all that as well. So before we move on to the sort of the open Q&A, I did want to address just quickly one question that I saw come in through the chat about sort of just the way training works and the way we typically handle that. So we have a whole bunch of different options for sort of a streamlined training process for both the OR schedulers and the clinic scheduling team. So we typically we split out training specifically for OR schedulers and then also for clinic schedulers as well. And we make that available through a whole bunch of different modalities. So we have a really robust sort of e-learning suite that sort of can build into your LMS that we've worked on a lot recently and are working to integrate. Then we also do a combination of sort of online, sort of in-person trainings, and then sort of material-based stuff that we can provide as well. So we come at that streamlined training process from a whole bunch of different angles. All right. So all that being said, that concludes sort of the more formal part of the presentation. We got about 15 minutes left, which is awesome. And I'll hand things back over to our moderator, Giles, to take us into that Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Derek and Whitney. As Derek mentioned, I'd like to transition to our Q&A portion for the remaining time. For our webinar attendees, please feel free to enter any questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. If we're not able to address your question in the time remaining, we're happy to follow up with you offline. First question for the presenters, how has the solution helped you navigate staffing challenges?
I would say there are both direct and indirect benefits as it relates to staffing challenges. So a direct benefit I would point to my endoscopy staffing, where we're looking for our next area of expansion. Currently, the scheduling and endoscopy is completed by patient care techs, and by creating this efficiency within my surgery scheduling team, they now have the opportunity to do more. And so they can take on that work, which thereby frees up those patient care techs to be doing other clinical work that maybe is being handled by nurses or others at this time. So there's some domino effects where, especially in a circumstance where you maybe have some people working in functions for scheduling specifically where they could be doing something else, that's a direct impact on staffing for sure. But I would also just say, indirectly, we, like many of you on the phone, I'm sure, have a large number of agency staff in our department currently. So it is incredibly important we are optimizing our schedules while we have those expensive resources in-house, whether it be circulators, surge techs, CRNAs, whomever it may be. So Qventus is really helping us to optimize our schedules so that we are maximizing what we are getting from those expensive agency staff that we have with us right now.
Okay, great. And next question. It looks like it's directed to you again, Whitney, but Derek, of course, feel free to jump in at any time. What led to your team's decision to do this work with an external partner versus building it in-house?
Yeah, that's a good question. We certainly do build some dashboards and scheduling tools internally, but for this one, we really didn't even necessarily consider doing so, in part because of speed of implementation was a concern. COVID, you all know this, COVID caused a lot of disruption around surgery scheduling, and we were very motivated to work through backlogs and meet patient care needs as efficiently as possible, which was part of why we looked to an external partner. That said, we did evaluate multiple external options, and at the end of the day, we felt Qventus would be our best partner given the value proposition and the problems we were trying to solve for.
Okay, and then what advice would you give other OR leaders evaluating these types of solutions?
Well, going back to my prior response, I think it's important that leaders are clear on the problem they're trying to solve while evaluating different vendors or scheduling solutions. I think it's also important to recognize that this is going to be an ongoing relationship, and it's important that leaders have confidence that the vendor they're selecting is going to be a responsive partner, and certainly that has been our experience in working with Qventus.
Okay, and looks like this one is directed to you as well. Whitney, how has your share of cases from independent surgeons improved?
Oh boy, it would be hard to measure any shifts in independent surgeon volume in a vacuum, and I suspect that most people on the call would question my judgment if I tried to do so, given that implementing Qventus was just one of a handful of tactics we pursued in order to influence scheduling patterns. That said, anecdotally, we're seeing movement of cases, specifically in the robotic space, but I do think with a longer time period to assess and kind of normalizing for some of the variation we've seen over the course of the last couple of years related to COVID and other factors, I am confident we will see a measurable shift. So more to come. I'm going to keep a close handle on it, but I don't have a firm number for you today.
Yeah, just to add on to that one a little bit, I think one of the things that we've seen consistently is just like the friction associated with being able to schedule is a big factor. Obviously, like, surgeons will have individual preferences or sort of insurance requirements about where they do cases, but a lot of it at the end of the day ends up being like, where is it easiest to get on the schedule? And I think one of the things that we've seen with Qventus at Abbott specifically is that like that process and that reduction of that friction has been really huge for offices, and just being able to like really quickly see things and simplify that process.
Okay, and then let's see. So next question: how has the solution improved schedulers' workload?
They're certainly more efficient, which is allowing to take on the scheduling functions and additional departments that I alluded to. But more importantly, they're able to do more while also reporting the higher level of job satisfaction and engagement. And I don't know. I couldn't provide a specific ROI for you if you were asking me, what implementation of this program would mean relative to scheduling staffing expense. I know I did see a question in the chat about ROI as well. And part of that is because we just never intended to reduce our staffing in that area, but rather have them take on more work.
Okay, and then we have a question here for Derek. What strategies do you use to incentivize block releases?
Yeah, I love this one. This is a fun sort of core question, right? Because block release, as we talked about earlier, sort of like underpins everything else that we do. So there's a couple of things, I think some of which I talked about earlier, and then a few of which we can add on. So one of the things that we do is we show you that it's not just like an imaginary number that we're making up, right? So every prediction email or nudge that goes out to surgeons, right, like has the actual probability that's sort of behind our predictions. It shows you why we're making that nudge. The other thing that we try to do too is sort of fold in a couple different incentives for release, right? So one of them, if it's before a manual release, is just going to be block utilization credit, right? Reminding them like, hey, like you might be at 70% now, but hey, if you release this block that we're showing you, you release these 8 hours, 6 hours at a time, whatever it happens to be, like you could go up to 74, 75% utilization. And if you're right along that threshold for maintaining your block, that can be a pretty powerful reminder. The other thing that we do too, I think, is we also tell people in these messages that we sort of increase their priority for future available time outreach notifications if they give up that block time. And I think that's sort of the virtuous cycle that we talked about earlier, right? The idea is like, one of the things that we'll see sometimes at hospitals is like, well, I don't really want to give up my block because I have no idea if I'm going to be able to get on the schedule here. And so the idea is like, hey, we sort of build that trust by like, one, having that time finder and available time outreach work well in general, but two, like being more likely to sort of bump you up in the priority for available time outreach notifications if you're a good steward and you release that time back to the OR. So the idea is like, you'll have it when you need it, but if you're not going to use this specific one, we'd appreciate it if you release.
Okay, great. It looks like we have a question here from Brent. let's see, looks like for Derek again. So how does Qventus work with Epic scheduling? Can you schedule via Epic but have Qventus work in the background instead of scheduling cases via Qventus?
Yeah, 100%. So I'll answer it first, and then I'll kick it over to Whitney for any additional comments on this one. So as Whitney mentioned earlier, we do support a couple different workflows. So it depends. We have some hospitals where there's sort of very little access to Epic, and then we have other clients who have a very high degree of Epic access, even for some of their like outlying independent clinics, right? Like through like CareLink or any of these other solutions. So what I would say is, yes, absolutely, we do support that process. I think what we found is that Time Finder and that ability to see time is an improvement on what you're seeing in like the Snapboard or the EHR in general, like regardless of which case submission modality you're using. Like it just simplifies out all the noise. Like instead of looking at like ORs 1 through 30 and having to like zero in on like the 1 or 2 spaces of open time, it just like shows you those 2 spaces of open time without all the other stuff. So what we'll see typically is, and Alina uses this workflow too, you'll have schedulers like submit through Epic and then actually find a time to put the case in Qventus, and then just include the information in that sort of Qventus request that the Alina OR scheduling team needs to link back to that case request over them submitted in Epic. So the short answer is yes, but Whitney, I'll kick over to you for any additional context on that one.
No, I wouldn't add anything more than that. That was a good explanation. I did see a question about timing, and that's something at your individual sites you'd want to work through with Qventus around. At what point in time do you stop using Qventus as your scheduling solution and implement one of your other processes, whether it's an elective case versus urgent emergent? And so there is some nuance there, but generally speaking, I think you covered it.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay, another question here from Gary. Is this used exclusively for scheduled elective cases, or can it be used for urgent emergent cases on off hours and weekends?
So that's a bit of what I was speaking to, where we have ours configured so that there is a specific time cutoff. So Derek, I don't know if you'd like to share. You know more probably about our configuration than I do, if you'd like to describe that.
Yeah, I can jump in. So yeah, so there's a couple levels on this one. So for urgent emergent cases, it depends a little bit on the priority. So when we do our initial configuration with hospitals, we can sort of set different thresholds for basically what you want the cutoff point to be for what actually shows up in Time Finder, right? So like how close to the date of surgery is too soon for what time we show. So what we have at Abbott right now, and what we have across a lot of our client partners, is 2 days. So basically, once you hit that 2-day mark, then at that point, you probably want to call or email the OR scheduling team. And the idea is that there's usually going to be like pretty acute staffing considerations at that point. Like you might have to like move rooms around or sort of change the schedule in other ways that are like a little more like urgent and immediate. And that often requires that sort of in-person, not in-person, but like over the phone type of coordination. On the weekend side, because I know that was part of the question as well, we actually do have the capability of showing a weekend available open time. We don't currently have that set up that way at Abbott, but it's definitely something that we're looking into exploring in the future.
Okay, so it looks like that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Whitney Johnson and Derek Fine for an excellent discussion, and also to Qventus for sponsoring today's webinar. Thank you again for joining us today, and we hope to see you at future Becker's webinars.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.